The worst thing about being discarded was how quiet it was. No ceremony, no witnesses. Just a folded piece of parchment slipped beneath the door of the room she had shared with her mate for 2 years, and the sound of boots descending stairs that she would never hear climb back up again. Kate stood in the middle of that room for a long time after reading it, long enough for the single candle on the dresser to melt down to a flat disk of pale wax and die. Long enough for the cold to move in through the cracks in the window frame and settle into her bones the way cold always settles into people who have stopped fighting it. The letter was not long. It did not need to be. 3 sentences were enough to end a life. I am dissolving our bond. You have no standing in this pack. Leave before the morning bell or the guards will be asked to escort you out. It was signed with a name she had loved once. She did not love it anymore. She set the letter on the dresser, smoothed it flat with 2 careful fingers, and then she dressed in the dark. She had been an Omega her entire life. She understood, in the way that only Omegas truly understand, that belonging was always conditional. That the ground beneath you could become water without warning. That the people who said stay in spring were the same ones who said go before winter. She had told herself that Connor was different, that his bond mark on her neck meant something permanent, that the Ashford Pack, with its stone walls and its wide hunting grounds and its 200 wolves, was finally a place where she could stop running. She had been wrong about all of it. The mark on her neck had faded 3 weeks ago. She had noticed it in the bronze mirror above the wash basin, the outline blurring at the edges, losing its depth, the way ink loses its shape when paper gets wet. She had told herself it was the light. She had told herself she was tired. She had told herself a great many things that were not true, because the truth, when it finally arrived folded inside a piece of parchment, was worse than anything she had imagined in the dark. She took only what fit in a single traveling sack, a change of clothes, a small roll of bandaging linen, the coin purse, lighter than it should have been, because Connor had controlled the household accounts, and she had never thought to ask why. A small glass bottle of dried lavender that her mother had given her years ago, before her mother was gone. She held it for a moment, turned it in her fingers, and put it in the sack. She did not look at the room when she left. The night outside the Ashford estate was deep and moonless, and smelled of rain that had already fallen, and rain that was still coming. Kate moved quickly through the back lanes of the pack grounds, keeping to the shadows behind the stables and the woodcutters' sheds, because she knew that Connor's version of leave before the morning bell could easily become I had her removed for causing a disturbance if anyone saw her walking out through the main gate with her face arranged the way her face was arranged right now. She was not crying. She had gone somewhere past crying, into a place that felt like a very large, very empty room with no doors in it. She had been walking for nearly an hour when the rain began in earnest. It came down in cold, determined sheets, the kind of rain that doesn't announce itself gradually, but simply arrives all at once, as though the sky had been holding it back and suddenly lost patience. Within minutes, her cloak was soaked through. Her boots, which had never been particularly good boots, began to let water in at the left heel. The dirt lane she was following turned soft beneath her feet, and twice she slipped, catching herself on the wooden rail of a fence she couldn't quite see in the dark. She stopped walking when she reached the edge of Ashford territory. She felt it before she saw any marker, the way Omega wolves always feel the edge of a pack's claim, a subtle shift in the air, like the world exhaling. Crossing that line meant she was packless, unclaimed. In the language of their world, that meant she was no one. She crossed it anyway. The road beyond the boundary was unfamiliar. She had not traveled much during her 2 years with Connor. He had preferred her close to home. She understood now what that preference had actually been. It was easier to control what you kept contained. She walked with her sack pressed against her chest and her head down against the rain, following the road because the road was the only thing she could still see, a pale stripe between the dark edges of trees. She did not know how long she walked. She knew her feet were hurting. She knew the cold had moved past her skin and into something deeper, the kind of cold that makes a person's thoughts slow and strange. She was beginning to think, in the vague way of someone very tired and very wet, that lying down in the grass beside the road might be acceptable when she saw the light. It was faint, a single orange point between the trees, the kind of light that comes from a lantern hung on a hook, rather than from a window. She stood still and looked at it for a long moment, because she had learned, in the last few years, that lights in the dark were not always safe things to walk toward. But she was cold, and the rain was not stopping, and her left boot was entirely full of water now. She walked toward the light. It was a barn, large, old, built from dark timber that had gone almost black with age and weather. The lantern hung above the wide double doors on an iron hook, swinging slightly in the wind, and the doors themselves were closed but not latched. One of them had swung inward a few inches, leaking warmth and the thick layered smell of hay and animals and dry wood. Kate stood before those doors and understood that she was about to ask something humiliating of whoever owned this place. She was also understood that she was out of alternatives. She pushed the door open enough to step inside. The barn was warm. Dramatically, almost shockingly warm, compared to what was outside. And for a moment she simply stood just inside the door and felt the warmth move against her face like something alive. There were horses in the stalls along the left wall, 4 of them, large and well kept, turning their heads to look at her with the calm, considered attention of animals who are not easily alarmed. Hay was stacked high on the right side, bales bound with rough twine, and somewhere near the back, a single oil lamp burned on a wooden post. A man was sitting on an overturned crate near that lamp. He was not what she expected. She had expected a farmhand, perhaps, or a stable boy half asleep. What she found instead was a man who looked as though he had chosen to sit in a barn, the way other men chose to sit in council chambers. Completely still, completely present, taking up exactly the space he occupied and no more. He was large. Not in the exaggerated, performative way of pack enforcers who wanted you to notice their size. In the way of something built for function. Dark hair. A jaw that had not seen a razor in several days. Eyes that lifted from the book in his hands and found her immediately, without surprise, as though he had heard her coming from a long way off. She suspected he had. He looked at her, soaked through, shaking slightly, holding a traveling sack against her chest like a shield. And he did not reach for a weapon, did not stand in a way that blocked the door, did not ask her name or demand to know her pack affiliation. He simply looked at her the way you look at something that requires an honest assessment before any other response. "The rain's bad tonight," he said. His voice was low and even, the kind of voice that doesn't need volume to carry. "Yes," Kate said. Her own voice came out smaller than she intended. She straightened her spine. "I'm sorry to intrude. I saw the lantern." She paused. She had rehearsed this in her head while walking, and now the rehearsal felt foolish. "I'm only asking for one night. I can sleep in the hay. I won't disturb anything. I'll be gone before your household is awake." The man looked at her for a moment longer. Then he closed the book. "There's a blanket on the 3rd hook by the far stall," he said, "and a tin of water on the shelf above it. It's clean." That was all. He did not ask where she had come from. He did not ask who had let her get this cold, or why a woman was walking alone on a road in the middle of the night with a traveling sack and boots full of water. He simply told her where the blanket was and went back to his book. Kate found the blanket. She found the water. She climbed up into the hay and wrapped herself in the rough wool and lay listening to the rain on the barn roof and the quiet breathing of the horses below and the occasional soft turn of a page. She did not sleep for a long time, but for the first time in weeks, she felt something that was almost safe. She did not know yet who the man was. She did not know that the horses in the stalls below her were worth more than the entire Ashford estate. She did not know that the man who had handed her a blanket without asking her name was the reason half the wolves on the continent slept with their doors locked at night. She did not know any of it yet. She only knew the rain was loud, and the barn was warm, and no one had told her to leave. For tonight, that was enough. She woke to the smell of bread. Not the distant decorative smell of bread baking somewhere far away in a kitchen she wasn't allowed into. the close, immediate smell of bread that was already warm and already near. Kate opened her eyes to hay and gray morning light filtering through the gaps in the barn's timber walls, and it took her 3 full seconds to remember where she was and why. Then she remembered, and the 3 seconds of peace dissolved. She sat up slowly. Her cloak had dried unevenly overnight, stiff at the edges and still slightly damp at the center. Her hair was a catastrophe. Her left boot, sitting beside her on the hay bale where she'd left it to dry, was still misshapen from the water. She looked down at herself and felt something between exhaustion and a grim, hollow amusement at the picture she made. An Omega who had been bond-dissolved, soaked, and deposited into a stranger's barn like something the rain had carried in and forgotten. The man from the night before was gone. In his place, on the overturned crate near the lamppost, sat a cloth-wrapped bundle and a small clay mug. Kate climbed down from the hay carefully, her legs stiff, and approached the crate the way she approached most things now, with the particular caution of someone who had learned that gifts often came with expectations attached. She unwrapped the cloth. Inside was a heel of bread, still warm, and a wedge of hard cheese. The mug held something that smelled of herbs and hot water. Not tea, exactly. More like a medicinal steep, the kind with dried elderflower and something sharper beneath it that she couldn't immediately name. There was no note, no instruction, no condition. Kate sat on the crate and ate the bread and cheese and drank the herbal steep. And she did it slowly, with the deliberate attention of someone who understood that this might be the best meal she had for some time. Outside the barn, she could hear the sounds of a working morning, someone splitting wood at a regular, unhurried pace, the clank of a water bucket, the low exchange of voices too distant to make out words. The horses in their stalls had been fed already. She could see the fresh hay in the nearest rack, and the way they moved with the settled contentment of animals recently attended to. She should leave. She had said she would be gone before the household was awake, and she had already failed that promise. She rewrapped the cloth neatly, set the empty mug beside it, and stood up. She picked up her sack. She put on her boots. She walked to the barn door, pushed it open, and stepped out into a morning that was cold and pale and smelled of wet earth and pine smoke, and stopped. The barn sat at the edge of a property that was considerably larger than she had understood in the dark. The main house, she had assumed a farmhouse, something modest, was not a farmhouse. It was a hall, stone-built, wide, 2 stories with a 3rd tower at the east end, surrounded by outbuildings and a low outer wall. Guards stood at the gate, not the lazy, half-attentive guards of a minor pack elder, but alert men in dark wool and leather with the practiced stillness of people who knew exactly how to use the blades at their hips. The yard between the barn and the hall was busy with movement. Stable hands, kitchen workers carrying crates, 2 men consulting over a rolled document near the well. None of it looked like a farm. Kate stood in the barn doorway and recalculated everything. She was still standing there, recalculating, when the man from the night before came around the side of the barn with a bucket in one hand and a rope in the other, and stopped when he saw her. In daylight, he was even less what she had expected. She could see now what the lamplight had flattened. The quality of his clothing, plain but fine, the kind of plain that costs more than ornamentation. The way he moved, which was not the movement of a man who did chores because they were his chores, but of a man who did them because he had chosen to, which was a different thing entirely. He was perhaps 30, perhaps a few years more. The dark eyes that had assessed her in the barn last night assessed her again now, with the same unhurried patience. "You're still here," he said. Not an accusation, an observation. "I was leaving," Kate said. "I am leaving, She stopped. She was not sure what she had just been doing, staring at his haul and reconsidering every assumption she'd made, mostly. "Thank you for the bread. You needed it." He set the bucket down. "Where are you going?" The directness of the question caught her off guard. Most people, when they encountered a packless Omega alone on a road, either ignored her or asked where she'd come from, who she belonged to, which was the way their world phrased it, as though belonging were a permanent condition and not something that could be dissolved in 3 sentences on a piece of parchment. This man had asked where she was going. "I don't know yet," she said, because it was the truth and she was too tired to construct something better. He nodded, as though this were a reasonable answer. "Your hands are shaking." She looked down. They were. She curled them into fists at her sides. "I'm fine." You were walking in cold rain for hours last night. You slept in a barn." He paused. "You're not fine. You're functional, which is different." Kate looked at him. "Who are you?" It came out more directly than she'd intended. Not rude, but stripped of the usual social softening, the polite dance of working up to a question like that. He didn't seem offended. Something shifted in his expression, something she couldn't read precisely, and then he said, "Dominic." Just the name. No title. No pack affiliation. No designation. Nothing that should have meant anything to a recently packless Omega standing in a barn doorway with wet boots and shaking hands. But the name landed differently than names usually landed. She felt it the way you feel a change in air pressure. Not painfully, not dramatically, just a sudden awareness that the atmosphere had shifted. She filed it away and said, "Kate. Kate." He said it once, trying the weight of it. "Come inside. There's a proper meal in the hall." "I don't..." She started to refuse. Refusal was automatic now. A reflex she'd developed in the last 2 years of being in a place where accepting things always meant owing something. "I shouldn't impose further." "You're not imposing. I'm inviting." He picked the bucket back up. "There's a difference." She followed him inside. The hall was warm and smelled of wood smoke and something roasting, and it was organized in the way that large households are organized when someone capable runs them. Not perfectly tidy, but efficiently arranged. Each thing in a place that made sense. A long table dominated the main room, and at it sat several people who looked up when Dominic entered, and then, with considerably more attention, when Kate entered behind him. She felt the attention, the way Omega wolves always feel the attention of people who know what she was. A slight pressure, a collective assessment. Not hostile, but not invisible either. A woman at the far end of the table, gray-haired, sharp-eyed, with the kind of face that has long since finished tolerating nonsense, looked at Kate for a moment and then looked at Dominic. "Found something in the barn," she said. It was not unkind. It was simply efficient. "Her name is Kate," Dominic said, and sat down at the head of the table with the ease of someone who always sat there. "She'll eat with us." The gray-haired woman's name was Helene, Kate would learn. She ran the household with the quiet authority of someone who had been doing it for decades and expected to continue doing it for several more. She set a plate in front of Kate without ceremony, thick porridge, a boiled egg, a strip of cured meat. And Kate ate it without ceremony either, because she was very hungry and the hall was warm, and sometimes basic physical need strips away the performance of dignity. Around the table were 6 others. 2 were clearly guards, eating quickly before returning to post. One was young, a boy of perhaps 15. Connor's age wasn't something she dwelled on, who kept stealing glances at her with the open curiosity of someone who hadn't yet learned to hide it. The remaining 3 were adults whose function she couldn't immediately determine, but who moved and spoke with the ease of people who had been in this hall a long time. Dominic ate and said little. He asked her once if the elderflower steep had helped with the cold, and she said yes, because it had. He nodded. That was the extent of it. She was almost finished eating when she caught the scent. It hit her mid-breath, between one heartbeat and the next. Something deep and resinous, like pine and dark earth, and something she had no exact name for, but that her Omega instincts recognized with an immediacy that bypassed thought entirely. Her hand stilled on her spoon. Something in her chest performed a strange, involuntary contraction, like a fist closing and immediately releasing. She had heard of this. She had read about it in the old texts her mother had kept, the ones that talked about mates and bonds and the particular ancient mechanism by which the wolves' world recognized its own arrangements. She had felt a version of it with Connor 2 years ago, a softer version, a warmer version, a version she now understood had never been entirely real on his side. This was nothing like that. This was not warm. This was deep. This was the difference between a candle and a fire that has been burning for 100 years. She looked up. Across the table, Dominic was already looking at her. He had gone very still, not tensely, not urgently, but with the deliberate stillness of a man who has just noticed something significant and is deciding very carefully what to do about it. She looked away first. She picked up her spoon. She finished the porridge. She did not acknowledge what had just happened, and neither did he, and she told herself that was fine, that was correct, that whatever her Omega instincts thought they had just identified across a breakfast table in a hall she had wandered into, out of cold desperation was almost certainly a mistake, or a reaction to stress, or simply what happened when a person was exhausted and recently wounded and sitting too close to a fire. She told herself this several times. It didn't entirely work. After the meal, Helene showed her to a small room on the ground floor. A guest room, modest but clean, with a real bed and a pitcher of water and a bar of soap that smelled of tallow and rosemary. Kate sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the wall and thought about what she was going to do next. She had no pack. She had very little coin. She had skills that were largely domestic. She could manage a household, preserve food, prepare medicines from dried herbs, keep accounts. Skills that were useful, but not skills that generated independence in a world organized around pack affiliation and alpha authority. She needed a plan. She needed, at minimum, a direction. What she did not need, what she was very firmly, very deliberately not going to need, was any further information about why a man named Dominic, in a hall that was clearly not a farmhouse, smelled like the oldest thing in the forest. She was not doing that again. She was not. She stayed 3 days. That was what she told herself on the first morning after breakfast. 3 days, to rest properly, to let the cold finish leaving her bones, to think clearly enough to form a real plan. 3 days was reasonable. 3 days was not weakness. 3 days was what a person with any sense would take before walking back out into a world that had recently made its feelings about her very plain. On the second day, Helene put her to work. It was not a command. It was simply that Helene appeared in the doorway of the small guest room at mid-morning with a basket of dried herbs that needed sorting, set it on the table without explanation, and left. Kate looked at the basket for a moment. Then she sat down and sorted the herbs, separating the elderflower from the valerian, the dried yarrow from the hyssop, checking each bundle for rot or moisture damage, tying the good ones back with clean twine. She worked with the automatic competence of someone who had done this 1,000 times. Because she had. When she brought the sorted basket back to the kitchen, Helene looked at her work without speaking for a long moment and then said, "You know your plants." "My mother was a healer," Kate said, "before she died." Helene accepted this information the way she seemed to accept most information, without surplus commentary, filing it away. "We've been without a proper healer for 8 months. The last one left when her family relocated north." Kate understood what was not being said. She also understood that she was not in a position to pretend she had other offers. "I'm not a trained healer. I know preparation and basic remedies. I couldn't manage a serious injury or a complicated birth without guidance. That's more than we have now." Helene wiped her hands on her apron. "I'm not asking you to commit to anything. I'm telling you there's work here, if you want it. Room and board included." Kate thought about the road. She thought about the coin purse, which had 17 copper pieces in it. She thought about what Packless Omegas generally found when they presented themselves to unfamiliar territories without recommendation or affiliation. "I'll stay a little longer," she said, "while I consider it." Helene nodded, as though this were the answer she had expected, and returned to her stove. On the third day, Kate learned who Dominic was. She learned it not from him. He had been away from the hall since the morning after her arrival, gone on something that Helene described only as territory business. But from the young boy, whose name was Pip, and whose primary personality trait was an apparently bottomless need to talk to anyone who would listen. He found her in the herb garden on the south side of the hall, where she was taking inventory of what grew there and what had been allowed to go untended, and he sat on the low stone wall and watched her work for approximately 4 minutes before the silence became intolerable to him. "You don't know who he is, do you?" Pip said. It wasn't a question. Kate was examining a lavender bush that had grown too woody at the base and needed cutting back. "I know his name." "Everyone knows his name." Pip said this with the delighted gravity of someone conveying very important information. "He's the Alpha King." Kate's hand stilled on the lavender. She straightened slowly and turned to look at the boy. "The Alpha King," she repeated, "of the whole Northern Reach." Pip nodded with enthusiasm. "All 7 territories. He's been king for 6 years, since he was 24. He beat the old council in a challenge that lasted 4 hours. 4 hours. The stories say the ground was—" He seemed to catch himself. "Well, he won. Nobody challenges him anymore. He comes out here sometimes when he wants to be away from the capital. The barn is where he goes when he wants to think." Kate looked at the hall. She looked at the guards at the gate. She thought about the quality of the horses in the barn, which she had noticed but had chosen, perhaps deliberately, not to examine too closely. She had slept in the Alpha King's barn. She had eaten his bread and his cheese and drunk his elderflower steep, and then sat across from him at breakfast and eaten his porridge, and quietly noted that he smelled like the oldest thing in the forest. She pressed her fingers against her forehead for a moment. "He didn't tell you," Pip observed, with the cheerful interest of someone who finds other people's realizations entertaining. "No," Kate said. "He didn't." She thought about why. She thought about a man who could have established his authority in the first 10 seconds of their encounter, who had every reason to, and had instead simply told her where the blanket was and gone back to his book. She filed this information next to the other things she was not yet sure what to do with. "Don't tell him I told you," Pip said, hopping off the wall. "He doesn't like it when I—" "Tell him what?" Both Kate and Pip turned. Dominic was standing at the corner of the hall, still in his riding coat, dark with dust from the road. He looked at Pip with an expression that was not quite a frown and not quite amusement, and landed somewhere precise between them. Pip vanished with a speed that suggested considerable practice. Dominic looked at Kate. "You know," he said, "just now." She looked at him steadily. She had decided, somewhere in the 3 seconds between Pip fleeing and Dominic speaking, that she was not going to perform either embarrassment or deference. She had spent 2 years performing both for a man far less worthy of them. "You could have mentioned it." "I could have." He came closer, not quickly, stopping at a distance that was respectful and not crowding. "Most people change how they behave when they know. I wanted to see how you behaved when you didn't." "And?" "You sorted the herb basket," he said, "checked the garden, ate what was put in front of you without complaint, and asked Helene 3 questions about the household water supply because you noticed the cistern drainage was inefficient." A pause. "You also cried once, in the guest room, on the first night. Quietly. You thought no one could hear." The frankness of it hit her like cold water. She held his gaze with some effort. "That's a great deal of noticing." "It's my hall." He said it without apology. "And you were in pain. I notice when people in my hall are in pain." Kate was quiet for a moment. The herb garden smelled of lavender and bruised rosemary and the faint mineral edge of the stone wall, and somewhere past the outer gate a horse was being led across cobblestones, the rhythm of it steady and ordinary against the strange texture of this conversation. "I was bond dissolved," she said. She hadn't planned to say it. It came out with the flat economy of something that has already been grieved enough that the words no longer draw blood. 3 days ago. My former mate, sent a letter. I left the same night." Dominic said nothing immediately. He looked at her the way he seemed to look at everything, completely, without hurry. What was his name? Connor Ashford. She paused. Of the Ashford Pack, South Territory. Something changed in Dominic's face. Not dramatically. A very small tightening around the eyes. A shift in the set of his jaw. The kind of change that happens in a man who has just received information and is deciding, with great precision, what to do with it. You know him, Kate said. I know of the Ashford Pack. He said it carefully. There have been reports. Irregularities in their territory tithe. Complaints from 3 border Omegas in the last year. He looked at her. Dismissed complaints. The word dismissed landed in her stomach like a stone in water, ripples spreading. Dismissed by whom? The Regional Council, which Connor Ashford's uncle chairs. Another pause. His family has significant influence over the Southern Council structure. It makes certain things easier to arrange. Kate was very still. She was thinking about the 3 weeks before the letter. The bond mark fading, which she had told herself was stress or imagination. She was thinking about a conversation she had overheard 6 months ago, late at night, through a door she was not supposed to be near. Connor's voice, and another voice she hadn't recognized, discussing something about consolidating the Omega registries and the inheritance clause in a way she hadn't understood at the time and had filed away as pack politics that didn't concern her. She was beginning to think it had concerned her very specifically. My mother left me a property, she said slowly. When she died, a small holding near the Fenwick border. I signed management of it over to Connor when we bonded. Standard practice, he said. He had documents prepared. She heard her own voice from a distance, assembling pieces she had kept deliberately separate for 2 years, because looking at them together had felt too frightening. The holding reverts to him if I'm no longer a bonded member of the pack. Dominic looked at her for a long moment. Yes, he said quietly. It would. The garden was very quiet. Kate looked at the lavender bush that needed cutting back and thought about how precise the timing had been. The fading bond mark 3 weeks before the letter, which would have been right around the quarter-day property assessment when holdings were registered and claims were formalized. She thought about dismissed complaints and Southern Council structures and a man who had spent 2 years keeping her close to home. She thought about how thoroughly she had been managed. He was never going to keep me, she said. Not a question. Not quite a statement. Something between the two. Something that needed to be said aloud in order to become fully real. It appears not, Dominic said. The anger came quietly at first. The way deep anger always comes. Not loud, not immediate, but rising from somewhere low and certain, filling in the spaces that grief had hollowed out. Kate had thought, on the road in the rain, that the worst thing was being discarded. She understood now that the worst thing was something else entirely. The worst thing was that it had been deliberate, that she had been useful and used, and then disposed of, at precisely the moment when keeping her would have cost him something. She had not been loved badly. She had not been loved at all. She had been managed. She lifted her chin. She looked at the Alpha King, standing in her borrowed herb garden, and said, with a steadiness that surprised even herself, I want to get it back. Dominic held her gaze. The property. The proof. Whatever documentation he used to arrange this. She paused. I want it on record what he did. Not just to me. To the others. The 3 complaints you mentioned. I want it not dismissed. A silence. Then Dominic said, that would require bringing a formal challenge to the Southern Council, which his uncle chairs. I know. His uncle would need to be removed from the chair first. That requires evidence of corruption brought before the full Continental Assembly. He looked at her with the expression of a man describing a climb without telling her it was impossible. It's not a short process. I'm not in a hurry, Kate said, which was not entirely true. She was burning with something that felt very much like hurry. But she had learned, in 2 years of being managed, that the most dangerous thing you could do was move before you were ready. Dominic looked at her for a long moment. Then he did something she didn't expect. He nodded. A single, deliberate nod. The kind that meant, not I agree, but I see you clearly, and what I see is serious. Stay, he said. Work with Helene. Learn the hall. Let me look into the Ashford records. A pause. You'll need more than anger to do what you're describing. You'll need evidence, witnesses, and someone with standing to present the case. And you? She asked. Why would the Alpha King involve himself in a Southern Council dispute over an Omega's property claim? He looked at her steadily. Because 3 dismissed complaints and a dissolved bond timed to a property transfer isn't a domestic matter. It's a pattern. He paused. And because you slept in my barn and ate my bread, and I find I'm not inclined to pretend I don't know what's being done to you. Kate looked at him. She thought about the scent in the breakfast hall, pine and deep earth and something ancient, and she thought about how carefully she was not thinking about it. I'm not going to be managed again, she said, by anyone. No, Dominic agreed. You're not. He said it the way people say things that are simply true, not a promise, not a reassurance. A fact stated plainly, by someone who intended to make it one. Kate looked back at the lavender bush. This needs cutting back, she said. I'll need proper shears. Helene has them, he said, and walked back toward the hall. The evidence came in pieces, the way truth usually does. Not all at once, not cleanly, but in fragments that had to be held up to the light and turned slowly before their shape became clear. Dominic had people. Kate understood this gradually, over the weeks that followed, in the way you understand the full size of something by walking around its edges rather than looking at it directly. He had people in the Southern Territories who sent letters written in careful, neutral language that nonetheless conveyed very specific things. He had people who knew which council clerks kept duplicate records and which ones didn't. He had a man named Edric, quiet, slight, with the unremarkable face of someone professionally forgettable, who traveled between territories gathering information the way other men gathered firewood. Steadily, without drama, because winter was always coming and you needed to be prepared. Edric returned to the hall 6 weeks after Kate's arrival with a leather satchel that he set on the table in Dominic's study and opened without preamble. Kate was in the room. Dominic had asked her to be there, which she had understood as a deliberate act, not a courtesy, but a statement of her standing in the matter of her own case. She stood beside the window, with her hands folded, and her face arranged into the expression she had developed over the past weeks, the one that projected steadiness, even when what she was actually feeling was considerably less steady. Edric laid out the documents one by one. The first was a property transfer record, her mother's holding near the Fenwick border, registered in Connor Ashford's name 11 days after their bonding ceremony. Standard enough on its surface, except for the date on the secondary document beneath it, which showed that the transfer paperwork had been prepared 4 months before the bonding ceremony. 4 months before Kate had signed anything, before she had even agreed to the match. She looked at the date for a long time without speaking. He planned it before, she said finally. Not a question. The Ashford family identified the Fenwick property when your mother's estate was filed, Edric said, in the careful, factual tone of a man who deals in facts and leaves the emotional weight to others. It sits on the only viable crossing point between the South Territory and the Fenwick grain routes. Whoever holds that property controls the toll rights on approximately 40% of Southern trade movement. He paused. It's worth considerably more than it appears. Kate thought about her mother. She thought about a woman who had kept a glass bottle of dried lavender and a collection of old texts and a small stone house near a river crossing, who had never seemed to Kate like someone who owned anything particularly significant. She thought about how her mother had died, quietly, of a fever, in the 3rd year after Kate's father was gone. And she thought about how quickly the estate had been assessed and filed, and by whom. Was my mother's death? She stopped. She started again. Was there any irregularity in the estate assessment? Edric glanced at Dominic. Dominic looked at Kate with the steady, honest attention she had come to expect from him, and she understood from the quality of that look that this was going to be worse than she had prepared for. The fever was real, Edric said carefully. But the estate assessment was conducted by a clerk employed by the Ashford family's regional office. The property valuation was recorded at less than a fifth of its actual worth, which allowed it to be classified as a minor holding, below the threshold that would have required a formal guardian to be appointed for you. Kate was very still. Without a guardian, she said slowly, I could be bonded without council oversight. At 19, Edric confirmed, which you were. She had been 23 when she bonded with Connor. She had believed she was choosing. She had believed the match had come through a mutual introduction, a customary process, a courtship of 4 months that had felt at the time like the first real thing that had ever chosen her back. She had been steered. From the moment her mother's estate was filed, she had been steered toward Connor, toward the bond, toward the signature on the transfer document, like water directed through a channel that had been dug before she even knew it existed. The anger that had been building for 6 weeks went very quiet inside her. That was how she knew it had moved into something more serious. It stopped being hot and became cold and exact. The 3 dismissed complaints, she said, the other omegas. Edric produced 3 more documents. Kate read them standing up, because sitting down felt wrong for this. Like performing grief, when what she was actually performing was inventory. 2 of the women had been bond dissolved under circumstances similar to hers. Their property interests absorbed into Ashford Holdings through variation of the same mechanism. The 3rd had not been dissolved. The 3rd had disappeared from the Southern Registry entirely, her record marked with a notation that meant relocated, no forwarding affiliation. Where is she? Kate asked. A pause. We don't know yet. She set the documents down on the table with precise care. Find her. Edric looked at Dominic again. Dominic said, Keep looking. Edric nodded and began gathering his materials, and Kate turned to the window and looked out at the herb garden, which she had spent the past 6 weeks putting back into order, cutting back the woody lavender, dividing the overcrowded yarrow, training the sprawling rosemary back against the wall. She had made it tidy. She had made it functional. She had learned, in this hall, that she was very good at looking at something neglected and understanding what it needed to become what it was supposed to be. She intended to do the same thing to the Ashford family's arrangements. The night the plan became real was also the night everything nearly fell apart. It was deep winter by then. 4 months after her arrival, the ground outside frozen hard, and the windows of the hall etched with frost patterns that the morning light turned briefly beautiful before the day warmed enough to dissolve them. Kate had settled into a rhythm that she recognized, distantly, as the closest thing to peace she had felt in years. She worked with Helene. She maintained the herb stores. She had begun quietly to serve in the informal capacity of household healer. Nothing complex, nothing beyond her training, but a steady stream of minor injuries and winter ailments, and the occasional more serious matter that she managed carefully and referred to Dominic's counsel physician when she should. She was sleeping better. She was eating properly. She was not crying in the guest room anymore, partly because she had run out of that particular reservoir of grief, and partly because the guest room had quietly become her room, in the way that spaces become yours when you've reorganized their contents and learned which floorboard creaks and begun instinctively avoiding it. She was not thinking about the scent in the breakfast hall. She was not thinking about the way Dominic's voice changed register, very slightly, barely perceptibly, when he was speaking to her as opposed to everyone else. She was not thinking about the evening 3 weeks ago, when she had stayed late in the study going over the Ashford documents, and he had set a cup of the elderflower steep on the table beside her, without being asked, and she had looked up and found him watching her with an expression she did not feel equipped to examine. She was firmly, deliberately not thinking about any of it, which was why it was particularly inconvenient that, on the night the plan became real, she walked into the study to retrieve a document she'd left behind, and found Dominic sitting in the chair by the fire, with his head in his hands, and a letter open on the table beside him. And every carefully maintained distance she had constructed over 4 months became suddenly and completely irrelevant. She stopped in the doorway. What happened? He looked up. He looked for the first time since she had known him, like a man who was tired in a way that sleep didn't fix. "Come in," he said. "Close the door." She came in. She closed the door. She sat in the chair across from him because standing felt wrong, and she looked at the letter on the table and then at him, waiting. "Edric found the third woman," he said, "the one whose record was marked relocated." "Where is she?" "She's dead." He said it plainly, because plainness was a kindness in this situation, and he understood that. "She died 8 months ago. The official record says fever. Edric found a midwife in the South Quarter who says differently." He paused. She had tried to file a complaint, not through the regional council, directly to the Continental Assembly, bypassing the southern structure entirely. She was found dead within 2 weeks of submitting the filing. The fire crackled in the grate. Outside, somewhere, wind moved against the stone walls of the hall with a low, continuous sound. "They killed her," Kate said. "It appears so." She sat with this. She had known, in the abstract way that you know a thing is serious, that what she was pursuing was dangerous. She had understood that the Ashford family had influence and resources, and the kind of institutional protection that made men feel untouchable. She had not, until this moment, fully understood that untouchable men sometimes enforced their untouchability in very permanent ways. "That changes the nature of what we're building," Dominic said. "This is no longer a property dispute. This is evidence of a pattern of corruption that includes what is likely deliberate harm to a complainant." He looked at her steadily. "Taking this to the Continental Assembly now, which we have enough to do, puts us in a different kind of visibility. It puts you in a different kind of visibility. You mean Connor will know I'm coming? The moment we file with the Assembly, yes. His family has enough contacts that they'll know within days." He paused. "Which means you need to be somewhere they cannot reach you. Formally, legally, with standing that overrides anything the Southern Council can arrange." Kate looked at him. She understood what he was not quite saying, and she understood why he was not quite saying it, because he was being careful with her, the way he had been careful with her since the first morning in the barn, precise and deliberate, and never pushing into the space she hadn't cleared for him. "You mean standing as someone affiliated with your seat?" she said. "Yes." "As what, exactly?" The fire popped. He looked at her with the dark, patient eyes that she had spent 4 months not looking at directly for too long, because looking at them directly for too long had a particular effect on her that she had been managing with considerable effort. "I have felt the bond since the first morning," he said. "I think you have too." She didn't deny it. Denial would have been a performance, and she was finished with performances. "I have. I haven't said anything because you needed time. Because the last bond you were in was used against you, and I wasn't going to let you feel that the only path through this required accepting another one." He held her gaze. "I'm still not saying that. I'm telling you what I feel, and I'm telling you that there is a legal mechanism that would give you protection that cannot be challenged by the Southern Council or Connor Ashford or his uncle. And I'm telling you those are two separate things, and you can take one without the other, and I will support you either way." Kate looked at the fire for a long moment. She thought about a bond that had been planned before she knew it existed. She thought about signatures on documents prepared months before she signed them. She thought about a woman who had tried to file a complaint and had been dead within 2 weeks. She thought about a man who had pointed to a blanket in the dark and gone back to his book. She thought about 4 months of elderflower steep left without comment beside documents she was studying. 4 months of a voice that changed register almost imperceptibly when it was speaking to her. 4 months of someone who had known exactly what she was and what she had survived, and had never once made her feel that those things were a problem to be solved, rather than a life to be respected. She was not ready. She understood that she was not ready. That there were still places inside her that were defended, and defended for good reason. And that ready was not a destination you arrived at cleanly, but a direction you moved in. But she was moving. "I'm not accepting a bond because it's useful," she said. "I know," he said. "And I'm not accepting one because I'm afraid." "I know that too." She looked at him. "I'm saying I feel it. I'm saying it's real. I'm saying—" She stopped. She found the words that were actually true, underneath the careful ones. "I'm saying that I don't know how to do this without being afraid that it will turn into the last time. And I need you to understand that the fear isn't about you. It's about what I learned to expect." Dominic was quiet for a moment. Then he said, with the same simplicity he applied to everything that mattered, "I know. And I'm not asking you to stop being afraid. I'm asking you to let me stay close enough that you can see, over time, that the fear is wrong about me." Kate held that. She held it the way you hold something fragile, carefully, with both hands, not gripping. "All right," she said quietly. "Stay close." Outside, the wind moved against the stone. The fire burned steadily in the grate. And in the study of a hall she had walked into out of cold desperation 4 months ago, something that had been held carefully at a distance finally, quietly, began to move toward what it had always been. The Continental Assembly convened on the first morning of early spring, when the frost was still on the ground, but the light had changed. That particular shift in winter light that happens before the warmth arrives, where everything looks sharper and slightly more serious than it did before. Kate had never been inside the assembly hall. She had never expected to be. It was a vast, cold room in the Capitol, with stone arches so high that sound behaved strangely within them, voices arriving at your ears a half-second after they left the speaker's mouth, as though the room itself was thinking about what had been said before allowing it to continue. The floor was dark slate. The gallery seats rose in tiers on 3 sides. At the front, a long curved table held the seats of the 7 territorial representatives, 6 of them occupied by men who ranged from neutral to openly hostile in their expression, when Dominic entered with Kate at his side. The 7th seat was empty. It had belonged to the Southern Council chair, Connor's uncle, a man named Aldrich Vane, until 3 weeks ago, when Edric's materials had been presented to the full assembly in a preliminary session that Kate had not attended. She had been in the hall, going over her testimony, listening through 2 floors of stone to the sounds of a building rearranging itself around a new truth. Aldrich Vane had resigned before the formal proceedings began. He had done it quietly, through a written statement, and he had not appeared publicly since. The southern seat was being held in temporary stewardship while the appointment process was reviewed. This was the first of the things that had already changed before Kate walked into that room. The second was Connor. He was seated in the respondents' area, a section of floor to the left of the assembly table, enclosed by a low wooden railing that was purely symbolic, but somehow still managed to convey exactly what it meant. He looked smaller than she remembered. Not physically. He was still the same man, still the broad shoulders and the fair hair and the particular quality of handsomeness that had once seemed significant to her. But something in his bearing had contracted. He sat with the posture of a man who had believed, until very recently, that he was untouchable, and was only now beginning to understand that untouchable had always been a story he'd been telling himself. He looked at her when she entered. She looked back. She held his gaze for exactly as long as it took her to confirm that there was nothing left there that could hurt her. No residue of love, no complicated grief, nothing that would slow her down. Then she looked away, because he was no longer the most important person in the room. She took her seat beside Dominic at the presentation table and folded her hands and waited for the assembly to begin. It took 4 hours. The evidence was presented by Edric and by Dominic's counsel advocate, a composed woman named Sarah, who spoke with the measured precision of someone who had prepared this case the way a craftsperson prepares a piece of work meant to last, attending to every joint and seam. The documents came out one by one. The property transfer prepared 4 months before Kate's bonding, the undervalued estate assessment, the dissolved bonds and absorbed holdings, the pattern of dismissed complaints, and finally, the evidence around the third woman, the midwife's testimony, the timeline of the filing and the death, the chain of communication that connected the regional council office to the decision that had silenced her. The room was very quiet during that last part. Kate had read all of it multiple times. She had thought she was prepared for hearing it stated aloud in a formal setting, in front of 7 territorial representatives and a gallery full of observers. She had been wrong about that. In the specific way that you can know a thing intellectually and still find that hearing it spoken in a cold stone room with perfect acoustics does something to your body that reading it on paper does not. She kept her hands folded. She kept her face still. Under the table, Dominic's hand moved to rest beside hers, not touching, not claiming, simply present, a few inches away, in the manner of someone who is saying, "I am here," without requiring you to need him. She moved her hand until it was against his. That was all. Neither of them looked at the other. When it was Connor's turn to respond, his advocate, a man who had clearly understood for some time that this was a very difficult case, offered a series of technical arguments about property law and bonding customs and regional council jurisdiction that the assembly heard in the particular silence of people who are waiting for something to finish. Connor himself said almost nothing. He looked once at Kate, with an expression she couldn't quite read. Not remorse exactly. Not defiance exactly. Something that might have been the beginning of understanding what he had actually done, arriving too late to be useful. She didn't look away from him this time. She let him look, and she let him see what was looking back. Not the woman who had sorted his household and preserved his food stores and signed documents she hadn't understood, and told herself that the bond mark fading was just the light. Someone else was looking back at him now. Someone who had walked through cold rain with wet boots and 17 copper pieces and had decided, in a stranger's barn, that she was not finished. He looked away first. The assembly's findings were read at the end of the 4th hour. The Ashford family's property holdings connected to the fraudulent transfers were to be dissolved and the assets returned. To Kate, to the estate of the second woman, to the family of the third. The Regional Council's complaint review process was to be restructured under direct continental oversight, eliminating the conflict of interest that had allowed complaints to be routed through offices controlled by the people they were filed against. Connor Ashford was formally censured, stripped of his pack elder status, and placed under a supervised administration that gave him no authority over property transfers or bonding records for a period of not less than 5 years. His family's hold on the Southern Council structure was, effectively, finished. The Fenwick property, her mother's stone house near the river crossing, with its toll rights and its 40% share of Southern trade movement, was restored to Kate in full, with documented acknowledgement that it had never legally left her possession. She sat and heard all of it, and felt something that was not triumph exactly. Triumph was too bright, too immediate. What she felt was more like the sensation of a weight she had been carrying for so long, she had forgotten its shape finally being set down. Not joyful, not dramatic, just the strange, sudden lightness of hands that have been gripping something too tightly for too long and are finally allowed to open. She thought about the third woman, whose name had been Mara, and who would not hear any of this. She let herself think about it fully, without looking away. Then she folded it carefully and put it where it belonged. Not forgotten, not set aside, but held in the place where serious things are kept, so that they continue to matter. After the session, in the antechamber, while the formal documentation was being prepared, Helene appeared. She had traveled to the capital with the household, insisting on it with the implacable practicality of someone who is not asking permission. And she put a cup of elderflower steep in Kate's hands and said nothing at all, which was the most she had ever said. Pip was there too, vibrating with the suppressed energy of someone who had been sitting still in a gallery seat for 4 hours and was now required to continue being restrained while adults did adult things around him. He looked at Kate with enormous eyes and said, "You didn't even look nervous." "I was very nervous," Kate said. "You didn't look it." "That's what you practice," she said. "Looking like what you need to look like until you're close enough to the thing that it doesn't matter anymore." Pip considered this with the seriousness of someone filing it away for future use. Dominic came to find her when the documentation was ready. He handed her the sealed restoration order, her name on it, her property named, the assembly seal pressed into the wax, and she held it for a moment, and then folded it and put it in the inside pocket of her traveling coat, close to her chest, where the glass bottle of dried lavender from her mother already lived. She looked at him. He looked at her. There was a great deal in that exchange that neither of them said aloud, because they had become, over the past months, people who communicated a significant amount without saying it. But some things needed to be said aloud, she had decided, because she was done with arrangements that lived only in silence and implication. "I want to go to the Fenwick property first," she said, "before we go back to the hall. I haven't seen it since I was 12 years old. I want to see what it is now." "All right," he said. "I want to decide what to do with it myself. I'll listen to your counsel on the trade rights, because you understand that world better than I do, but the decisions are mine." "They should be," he said, simply, as though there were no other way. "And I want—" She stopped. She found the real words, the ones underneath the practical ones. "I want what is being built between us to be built properly, without the pressure of the legal situation, and without me not knowing if I'm choosing clearly or choosing because I needed shelter." She held his gaze. "I'm choosing clearly now. I want you to know that." Dominic looked at her for a long moment. Something moved in his expression that she had not seen before. Not the controlled steadiness he usually carried, but something older and less managed. Something that had been waiting patiently for quite a long time. "I know," he said. "I'm still afraid sometimes," she said. "I know that too." "And you're still staying?" "Yes," he said. "I am." They went to the Fenwick property in early spring, traveling by carriage with 2 guards and Helene, who declared the house structurally sound and the herb garden disgracefully neglected, and immediately began drawing up a list of what needed doing. The stone house was smaller than Kate remembered, and more beautiful, the river crossing visible from the east window, the water moving over its stones with the uncomplicated persistence of water that has been moving that way for a very long time, and intends to continue. Kate stood in the main room for a while, and looked at the walls her mother had lived inside, and she let herself feel the full weight of what had been taken and what had been returned, both of them. She didn't perform either the grief or the recovery. She simply stood in the room and let it be real. Then she opened the windows to let the spring air in and went to help Helene with the garden. Connor Ashford's censure held. Under supervised administration, stripped of his council connections and his family's institutional cover, he spent the following years managing what remained of the Ashford holdings under close oversight. He did not recover the influence he had lost. The Southern Territory restructured its complaint process as mandated, and 2 cases brought in the first year under the new system were heard and resolved in the complainant's favor. Small things, real things. Aldrich Vane, his uncle, retired to a property near the coast and was not heard from in any official capacity again. The Southern Council seat was filled by a woman from the border territories who had spent 15 years filing complaints about regional corruption and being dismissed. She was not dismissed again. Mara's family received the restitution that the Assembly had ordered. Kate wrote to them herself, not officially, not through an advocate. She wrote a letter in her own hand and sent it with a small package of dried herbs from the Fenwick garden. She did not know if it was enough. She knew it was something. Pip grew into a young man with a gift for languages and an absolute inability to keep secrets, which Dominic managed by simply telling him less. He visited the Fenwick property twice in the years that followed and declared it the best-smelling place he had ever been, which Kate chose to take as a compliment to the herb garden, rather than the resident healer. Edric continued his work. He was very good at it. He was also, Kate gradually discovered, considerably less forgettable than his face suggested. He remembered everything and forgot nothing, and he had an opinion about nearly every situation that he expressed, only when asked but expressed with extraordinary precision when he was. He became, over time, someone she trusted, which was a category she was building slowly and carefully, and with great attention to who belonged in it. Helene retired from managing the household on a Tuesday morning approximately 2 years later, announcing it over breakfast with the same tone she used to announce that the cistern needed cleaning, and moved into a cottage on the Fenwick property where she grew vegetables with a competitive intensity that the vegetables had no way of responding to, but seemed to produce well under. She came to dinner every week and continued to have opinions about how the herb stores were organized. Kate and Dominic were bonded on a morning in late summer, in the herb garden at the Fenwick property, with the river audible through the east window, and the lavender in proper bloom, for the first time since she had cut it back 2 years before. There was no ceremony planned. It happened the way real things happen, quietly, between two people who had been moving toward each other for long enough that the arrival felt less like an event and more like a recognition. She was 26. She was standing in her mother's garden with her hand still carrying the smell of rosemary from the morning's work, and she was not afraid. She had been afraid for a long time. Fear had been the most honest thing she owned for several years. The cold, exact fear of someone who has been managed and discarded, and who understands, with the particular clarity of experience, exactly how much damage a person can sustain when they trust the wrong thing. She had honored that fear. She had listened to it carefully. She had let it teach her what it knew. And then, when the time came, she had set it down. Not because the world had become safe. The world was not safe. It was the same world it had always been, with its councils and its claims and its arrangements that benefited some people at the cost of others. And she intended to spend a considerable amount of energy on that problem for the rest of her life. Not because she had stopped expecting to be hurt. She had simply learned to distinguish between the fear that protected her and the fear that was keeping her from what was true. What was true was the man beside her, who had pointed to a blanket in the dark and gone back to his book, who had set cups of elderflower steep next to documents without comment, who had said "I know" when she told him she was afraid, and had stayed anyway, and had never once made the staying feel like a debt. What was true was the garden around her, restored and tended, growing the way things grow when they are given what they need. What was true was her name on a sealed document, in the inside pocket of her coat, her property and her standing restored, her mother's house full of morning light. What was true was herself, not the self that had been managed or the self that had survived, or even the self that had fought for this. All of them. The woman who had walked through cold rain with wet boots and not stopped. The woman who had sat across a breakfast table and noted, carefully and without drama, that something very old had just recognized something else. The woman who had learned that the most dangerous thing you could do was move before you were ready, and then had decided when she was ready, and moved. The lavender smelled exactly the way it should. The river kept moving. The morning light came through the east window and fell across everything she had made, and everything she had returned to, and everything she had chosen. And it was warm, and it was real, and it was hers. This is where her story ends, not because her life was finished, but because she was no longer the woman who needed to be found. She had found herself, and that, in the end, was the only story that had ever mattered.